Hello everyone, my name is Janet Pierce, and today I'm privileged to be able to talk to you about budget management for the Tri-Service Nursing Program Post Award. So congratulations on getting your award. And now that you have it, we're going to talk about some of the items that you might need or be helpful with budget management. I have three objectives. The first is to describe when research activities can start after you have your grant, and to identify the various types of expenses that you may have during your grant, and then finally discuss some strategies that might be helpful to ensure funds are used before the TSNRP Grants Award has actually ended. One of the first things that I want to be sure that you understand, because this has changed this year, is the announcements that you have received a Tri-Service Nursing Grant Award. When it arrives, you can start purchasing items right away. That wasn't true in the past, but now you could start purchasing. But you may want to remember that a delay in your IRB, or the Institutional Review Board, or IACUC, which is the animal care approval, is not justification for more funding. So in other words, if it takes 6 months or 8 months to get your award, they may not extend your funds just because you're waiting for it. So if you begin purchasing, maybe there's some items that would be helpful, but try to get your IRB and IACUC approval as soon as possible. So you've gotten notification of funding, and there are some budget concerns that you need to think about. First, immediately review your budget for items that require what I call bids. So if you have a piece of equipment, let's say you're buying a iStat machine for a point of contact because you're going to do some blood measurements or arterial blood gases, then you may have to go through a bidding system depending upon the organization that you're at. So begin immediately as soon as you find out you have the award, whether or not you're going to have to do a bid, and if so, what is the cost? So for instance, some institutions, the level is at $5,000. So if you stay under $5,000, you don't have to bid. It can be a supply. But if you have, let's say, a piece of equipment like an iStat instrument that costs $10,000, then you're going to have to go through a bidding system to get that. So you could begin that process right away as soon as you get your grant. Then obtain what I call an organizational number so you can begin ordering supplies and equipment. Most places require that you have some sort of grant number, and you don't want to post it, let's say, on your corkboard or on a sticky outside. Secure that number, but be sure that you get a number so you can begin ordering. If you happen to have a ordering system that requires online, you may need more than one number. So begin to get your organizational numbers needed so that you can start purchasing items that you need for your grant. And then learn the process for ordering at your organization. So is it online? Do you have to go through maybe a department? Say you're on a base and you can't order any computers unless you go through the information technology group. Or maybe if you're ordering a lab type of item, you have to go through the hospital laboratory system. So find out the process for ordering the type of equipment and supplies you need for your budget. Hopefully you could do that before you actually get approval for IRB, so you get a head start when you want to start spending your money. Next, let's talk about suggested budget activities. The first thing I always suggest, and that I do when I have a TSNRP grant, is to get a grant notebook particularly related to the budget. So I get the original budget that I had in the grant, I get a divider, and then I put in the monthly budget for my organization. And the name of our budget form is called an AM90. So you need to know the terms that your organization may use for the budget information that they send you. Hopefully you find out whether they send it to you every month, every 2 weeks, or quarterly. Ideally, it's best to have it every month. So let's say just recently I'm waiting for the next AM90 at my institution for my Tri-Service grant so I can do a report. So the July AM90 hasn't come out yet. It comes out the middle of the month for June. So it's always a little delayed, and you kind of need to know for your organization when that monthly budget comes out. And when it does come out, put it in a notebook so that you keep a record. Also, I like projected budgets. Our organization has a person that helps us do projected budgets each month, so I know how much I have left in the supply category or personnel category, or maybe you're having to pay for recruitment of subjects and so forth. Also, make sure that you keep your budget numbers secure. Now, those are all in a notebook, but also I like to organize right away when I get a grant my computer files. There's two types. One is in your email. So if you have a Tri-Service Nursing Grant folder email file, I would have a subfile in there for specifically just for budget, because you're going to get different items related to budget that you need to know and put it in that folder. And also, when you get TSNRP emails specifically related to budget, you can put it in that folder. So those are two ways, paper and email. I do both, and I would suggest that you do both. Because sometimes, let's say someone in your organization wants to discuss the budget, you don't want to bring all the emails, and maybe the computers don't work and you can't communicate the budget information. So I just bring the notebook. That's why I have both. The next is you want to be efficient about accounting system when you get this grant. Identify the costs by program, by year, and by category. Also, if you have indirects, you need to know how much you have for direct cost and for indirect cost. Provide management with financial reports at both the summary and detailed. So that means the overall how much you have left, the summary for direct cost or indirect, and also very detailed level. So you're going to need that for TSNRP for reports and also for your own organization. The common budget mistakes that I hope that I can help you to avoid, the first one is failure to monitor and review the grant budget periodically. I know investigators that get so wrapped up in the research because they're excited about it, they forget this very important part about monthly periodic budget review. And the reason why you do that is because you can catch mistakes early and save yourself some money. And I'll give you some examples later during this presentation. Or how about forgetting about taxes and shipping costs? So let me give you an example. Just recently on the TSNRP, this last year, we sent off some biospecimens to be analyzed at a laboratory in Florida. And I had budgeted money for sending it FedEx, but I found out because it was blood and because it had to be overnight shipped, there was special packaging that I hadn't budgeted for. But luckily, I still had money in the supplies enough to cover that. So there are many times you don't know the cost, and what I budgeted for sending it, by the time I got the grant on the second or third year, the cost for FedEx went way up for hazardous blood materials. So I overspent for that, but I had saved some money in supplies. I didn't use this quite as much, so I had money to cover it. So also watch out for underpricing. And just because it may be cheaper doesn't always mean it's better. And I've had that accident. One time we were buying some tubes for specimens, and the tubes at Fisher were cheaper. And it was a new brand, and I thought, wow, that's a lot cheaper. But then I found out the lids don't screw on. And then you have the big problem that the specimen comes out when you start spinning it because it pops off. So that was a waste. So that was underpriced, but I paid a big cost for that. So, and then overspending. The same thing. You can overspend for something that isn't any better quality. So watch for underpricing or overpricing. And then one of the biggest things I find out for new investigators particularly is disorganizing budget information. They get the categories wrong. They think that they have more money, let's say, in supplies or in personnel. They don't realize they haven't counted for fringe and how much fringe might be for a federal employee. Those are some common mistakes that I hope that you'll avoid and think about as you start your Tri-Service Nursing Research Program. So during the course of the grant, budget reports will be required for several instances. So for instance, the TSNRP will have an interim report, an annual report, and a final report. So it is a little difficult to do this interim report sometime for your budget because let's say, for my instance, we got funded in July. We got notice in July, and by the time I got my approval to begin the study, it was the middle of December. So the annual report was now due in January, and I'd only been actually been able to do the study for about 3 weeks, and it was during the holidays, so we didn't get a lot spent. But because we had done things early, at least I had gotten the equipment, it was in the bidding system, and I had something to write in the interim report. So as soon as you get your grant and you think about budget, think about these budget reports and what you're going to put for your interim. The interim report was a little bit easier because by then you've spent some money to begin your study. And then of course the final report, you hope that your budget is zero, that you've spent all the money. That is the goal of TSNRP, is they want you to spend all the money that the organization has gotten towards the research. And I'm lucky at the organization that I'm at, my research dean told me, make sure that you spend at least $100 to $300 over, because we want you to use all that, and with the indirects that we get, we could cover you some for a little bit extra. So I always spent all the money for the TSNRP on my grant. There's none left over that's not being used specifically for the aims of the grant. If you have any requests for changes in the project, be sure that you ask for that related to the budget. TSNRP is really a great organization that understands when you have budget issues, and I'll give you some examples in a minute. Or for any other instances that you might need budget questions, don't hesitate to talk to them. So during this interim review that I talked about, you have to talk about what's happened and the expenditures that you've had. Project out how much you're going to need. It's a good time to say, you know, I don't have enough money for supplies. I realize, for instance, iStat cartridges one time in a TSNRP grant, I had budgeted $5 a piece, and by the time I got the grant, it had gone from $5 to $10 a cartridge. So that's double. So those are the type of things that might, at the interim report, you might want to talk about TSNRP that you're going to be over in the supply budget. So again, review your monthly categories, not only for TSNRP, but specifically for your organization for the interim report. Now this is an example, I know it's small, but this is an example of a report that I get at my organization. They give me the project period, they give me the different categories. Personnel, OOE is the outside outlying expenses, but that's not a category that TSNRP uses. They use other terms, and I'll go over that in just a minute. And then travel is the same, and same thing with supplies. And capital outlay, that's not what TSNRP uses. That's what my organization uses. And so I know capital outlay means equipment for the TSNRP. And for OOE in my organization, that means consultants. Or for me, different types of consulting fees for different groups. Or for instance, if I use a core facility, those are the core facility fees. That's the operating expenses for TSNRP. It's called consulting. Now, managing your grant, learn the grantee organization account methods. Is it each month? And when you look at it, here's the things you got to remember. Is it the wrong amount? One time I got my report, and instead of being $50, it was $500. They put in an extra zero. So those things like that happen. The wrong project or account. My last name's Pierce. There's another Pierce on campus. They had charged my wrong Pierce on the grant. So they had charged something that I didn't order. It wasn't me. So be sure, particularly if you have a common name, that your organization didn't charge from another investigator. And sometimes I noticed double charges. In other words, I ordered one thing and they charged it twice. So be careful. And then we find out we get things and it's the wrong item or it doesn't fit, and we return it, and it's never been accredited back to our budget, but yet they've been given the money. So be really careful for those four things: wrong amount, wrong project or PI, double charges, or return items. So review the expenses from the grantee organization often, particularly with the TSNRP categories, and compare them. So these are the TSNRP categories. Personnel are the same in most places, but consulting may be called something else. For me, it's OOE. Equipment isn't called equipment at my organization, it's called capital outlay. But I know for TSNRP, it's called equipment. And those are all the categories that you've already done your budget on. So also have this form and keep this in a folder and also on email. So monitor your accounts, as I mentioned, and anything that requires extra, it may not be in the terms and conditions of the grant contract or application that was signed by your organization. You may need pre-approval. So here's when you do need pre-approval for TSNRP. If your total, listen to this very carefully, if the total accumulative amount is less than 10% of the entire budget, you need to do that. So what does that mean? Let's say you have some extra money in personnel and you need it more for supplies, and it's more than 10%, then you need to do that. Or, for instance, if it requires equipment, let's say, for instance, what happened to me one time in a past one is I use a minus 80-degree freezer and mine basically broke. And I had some extra money in supply, and it was going to cost me about $6,000. So I contacted them and said, would that be okay to take some supply money out and put it in the equipment? So I did a form and requested that. And that gets into prior approval that's required. Again, it's the 10%. You do a change request form is what I did for that freezer. And I gave the justification. You know, the freezer broke, that's where we kept the samples. Currently I have the samples in someone else's freezer that I hope they don't throw out until I can get one. They were very good about it, and I was able to now get my freezer and put my samples in. Also, unanticipated change in your original budget can occur, and again, request additional funds from the TSNRP. Let me give you an example that happened about a week ago. We're doing a publication. I'm pretty well done with the grant. I don't have much money for publications in my current grant. I've already done that. And I'm doing a heat map with genomics, and it requires color. And Nursing Outlooks wants $750 to print those. And so I contacted the director, told her the issue, sent the pictures, and she said, sure, TSNRP will pay the $750, have them contact us, and we'll pay for the color print for that publication. So those are the types of things that you don't anticipate because you don't know what your data is going to look at the end. Also, any remaining funds I just mentioned, track them carefully. Both the PI and the granting organization should reevaluate the budget periodically throughout the years, and TSNRP has these reports that they expect you to do that. Also, as I mentioned, the interim report is also very sometimes difficult because you haven't done much yet, but it's a good time to see if you're going to have the right amount or find out if anything's doubled in price. Another example, one time I put in a grant for sodium pentobarbital, and it was $150 a bottle, and for some reason in the United States it jumped from $150 a bottle to $800 a bottle. I didn't budget that. So that at the interim report, I talked to the TSNRP about that and what we could do, and it was okay according to the uses terms and conditions. So a summary of significant events during a period of report is important. For instance, let's say you have to reallocate $20,000 from personnel over to the supply category because something happened or you're looking at something different. Make sure that you talk to TSNRP about this budget issue for reallocation. So other important things to remember is that at the end of the project, as I mentioned, they want all that money spent on the grant and not just given back to your organization for other expenses. In other words, try as hard as you can to have zero. Ask your department head, ask your Department of Nursing director, would it be possible to spend over maybe $50 or $100 so that I spend every penny of the TSNRP on this grant, on the things and on the aims that I told TSNRP that I was going to spend the money for. So the closing of the grant, as I mentioned, I start at 6 months. I meet with my granting agency. So if you're at any, Bethesda or you're in San Antonio, wherever, get with your granting department and find out how much you have left and carefully plan how you do it. That gives you time because sometimes things take 2 or 3 months to clear in a budget for them to get it. So you need to order it. Our policy at my organization, and actually I've made this personally, is I stop spending 3 months before the grant's over so that there's no hiccups that come in, a month after the grant's over. The bill came in that's been delayed. I make sure that that's done so we don't spend after 3 months. Find out what your organization's policy is for when you have to plan to stop ordering things. And if it's at the end of a fiscal year, you've got to make sure that you aren't spending money that will be delayed when your grant's over and then you get a bill for $200 and there's no money, or that the grant has closed. So watch carefully. These are the last things, the last slide basically. Make sure that you do and review your monthly budget reports. And never transfer funds from categories like supplies to travel. So if you have extra money and you're thinking, oh, I have $2,000 in travel and I've got all this extra money in supplies, why don't I just invite another investigator for $2,000, move it from supply to travel? That's a no-no. You don't move extra money into travel unless you talk to TSNRP. That's pretty clear for most organizations, but it's usually okay. Let's say I didn't spend all the money in travel. Let's say I have $500 extra in travel. It would be okay to transfer it to supplies. But travel's always a little tricky area. Never move money in it, but if you want to move money out of it, that's usually okay. But talk to TSNRP if you have any questions. And finally, there's items that you don't purchase. And I've seen all kinds of crazy things purchased on grants that shouldn't be. For instance, they want to have a celebration when they get the grant and they buy all this food at Costco and they want to put it on the grant. That's not in your budget. Entertainment. I've seen people go out and, they've gotten a publication or maybe they've gone to a conference and they're going to go out and they want to go to a nice dinner and they want to get a gift for each person on the grant. No, that can't come from TSNRP funds, so don't do that. And then other unrelated grant items. So if you have any questions, again, I want to say contact TSNRP about any budget issues. Remember to keep up with it monthly. Don't be one of those investigators that you don't know how much you have each month in the kitty. And make sure that you use all your funds so that there's no funds left over that's not specifically for your research aims. And again, don't hesitate to talk to TSNRP. And I really thank you for listening carefully for the budget. I hope I've given you some helpful hints that will help you with your new grant. And congratulations on being an investigator with TSNRP. Thank you.